Hello. Yeah, good to see you. This is actually our last week of lectures. And so this is part one, and obviously Thursday will be part two. And these are the last lectures, the last you'll see of me lecturing. Hopefully we'll talk more on Zoom and on email. But yeah, it has been a wonderful, you've been a wonderful class. I've really enjoyed this. And hopefully we've managed to keep things together despite all the incredible difficulties we've been through in this last month or so. And so, yeah, obviously next week we'll be looking at our group projects, and the week after that we'll have a little bit of an exam, but then that's basically it. And, you know, I hope you're coping with everything. Good. Now, I wanted to say that you know, looking at the moment, you've got a very interesting thing going on economically. You've got the whole question of whether do we open up the economy or do we not? And hopefully with the whole concept of trade-offs and some of the things we've discussed, and me really showing that everything comes down to trade-offs, you know, you can think intelligently about that particular subject, because it's a classic economic trade-off. It's the health of the economy and maybe even the long-term sort of health of people and the families and the capital and the human capital of families against people dying and the health issues. So it's you know, and these are not simple. This is not a simple sort of question. Okay, so let's dive into the course. I've actually done the course. I taught this class half an hour ago, but I realised I hadn't done it correctly, and I've had to sort of do it again. So hopefully you'll get the benefit of second time around, you know, for you guys. So this week we're talking about economic inequality, which is, as you probably have noticed, one of my pet subjects, something I'm very particularly interested in. And, you know, this is something that you could talk all week about this. It's, you know, I'll talk a whole semester on this. It's a massive, massive area. And again, a bit like environmental economics last week, I'm only going to give you little tasters, little things to think about, maybe one or two models for you to start playing with. And because this is a vast, vast area. Okay, this is where I messed up last time. I showed you a video from my Twitter of one of my ex-students, and you can, you know, get on the slides and click on that link and see this, lovely girl, Jennifer Munoz, playing in a Mexican Clasico between Club America from Mexico City and Chivas from Guadalajara, and you see her scoring this amazing goal. She was in my microeconomics class, and she used to come to office hours, and we used to chat, and she would tell me about her career in soccer, and she's, you know, become a great player. And, you know, obviously when we talk about inequality, especially economic inequality, that's what we're talking about, economic inequality. And ultimately, you know, I was a very serious sort of left-winger in my youth, and I had to come to the terms with the fact that obviously people are different. You know, Jennifer has got this incredible skill at soccer. You know, I dreamed of having that as a child, and I didn't have that skill, and I had to face that. And so, you know, life is unequal. We all have different human capital. We all have, you know, different skills. You know, we have different desires, different levels of motivation, and so, you know, real serious equality is very, very difficult to attain. And, you know, you don't really know whether you'd want to attain that. But the question is, as economists, in that unequal world, in that sort of different distribution of gifts and skills and drive and passion, you know, is there a more, you know, is there a better way of having things? Is certain societies, you know, more equal society? Are they better than unequal societies? Is there an efficient level of inequality or equality that we can attain to? And these are not easy questions. questions. These are very deep and sort of interesting questions. So let me throw a little thought experiment at you at the beginning. Let us imagine two very strange countries. They're countries with only two people, country A and country B. Now, if you look at country A, one person earns $1,000 a year and the other earns $99,000 a year. If you go to country B, both people earn $50,000. And the question is, what are both countries' mean incomes? What is the average income for the country, for country A and for country B? And very sort of basic mathematics. You add the two wages together, you put it over 2, and actually both countries have exactly the same mean income. Both have exactly the same average income, but country A may be very, very different than country B. Country A may have all sorts of issues that country B doesn't have. And so when we talk about average income, and the US has got a very, very high average income, but that could be pushing up the income of that. It could be certain people pushing up that average income, and others may have very, very little. And so average income can sometimes present a bit of a strange picture of what's really going on in a country. So just think about that. And when we start to think about inequality, we realize that the majority of us, we live in a very, very rich country. The US is one of the, obviously in terms of GDP is by far the biggest economy in the world. And when you come to, even though the fact that, the US has a big population of like 350 million people, you say, like at the moment we talk about the coronavirus crisis and say, 45,000 people have died in the US, and only 23,000 people have died in Italy, the number 2. But, the US has got a population that's probably about 5 times that of Italy. So it's a big, big nation. But even despite that, the GDP per capita of each person, so that's technically what each person is earning. It's not exactly like that, but that you can think about like that, is very high in the US. There are certain countries that earn above 100,000. I think you may find Luxembourg and maybe Qatar, these very small thing, obviously Qatar with its natural gas and Luxembourg with its financial services are very, very high earning countries. And then you've got countries like Norway, Iceland, Ireland that are earning above 75,000. It's actually a bit of a cheat with Ireland. The average person really doesn't have anything like that sort of money. It's all about the way they allow foreign capital to be held in Ireland. And that means that that's artificially inflated. But then, taking away your Norways and your sort of Icelands, the next highest, and Switzerland, is the US. A GDP per capita between 50,000 and 75,000. In fact, it's near to sort of 61,000. It's very, very high. So you live in a country where the mean is very, very, very high, and that has an awful lot of positive effects. Obviously taxes and the vast infrastructure, the vast opportunities you have in the US are enormous. And then you see countries at the other end where, the average, GDP per capita is actually below $1,000. These are mainly in central sort of Africa. These are mainly landlocked African countries. You've also got others, Yemen, Afghanistan, East Timor, that one in the red over there. These are some of the sort of poorer countries in the world. And usually that's down to some quite deep sort of structural instability. Obviously, Afghanistan has been, fighting a war, in some sort of war situation since the late 70s, and that's the reason for its low sort of GDP per capita. But if you notice that, there's vast amounts of countries that even though are outside of Europe, they're outside of Western Europe, but they're rising. If you look at lots of South American countries, a lot of Asian countries, a lot of African countries, a lot of Central American countries, they're rising up through the income distribution. So, though there is still incredible inequality between nations, it is actually getting better. There would have been a period where, if you looked at these numbers, Western Europe would have been really, really relatively rich, and the rest of the world would have been relatively poor. And though you still have very poor areas, there is a movement towards equality between nations. Imperfectly, but it's, things are changing. So you've got this inequality between nations, but you've also got inequality across or within nations. And this is what we're going to look at in a moment, the whole concept of the Gini coefficient. That is basically within a particular nation, a particular society, how equal or unequal are they? Now, if you look at this key on the bottom left-hand corner, you've got basically the lower the Gini coefficient, the better. So if it's minus 0.25, the very, very green, which Sweden has, for example, that's very positive. And, the greens tend to be good. The blues are like, okay, they're not so good. Purples, it's getting pretty difficult. And then when it gets to the sort of oranges and reds and pinks, that would probably be a real problem. And you see some of the most unequal countries, places, some of the richer African countries are very unequal, incredibly high Gini coefficient, over 0.6, and we'll look at what that means in a minute, but like Namibia, Botswana, South Africa, the growing countries are struggling, very unequal. China is very unequal. Brazil, Bolivia, these are very unequal countries. Colombia, very unequal. But if you look, the same Gini coefficient of China is actually in the US. And if you look at it, if you look at all the Western European nations, Canada, or what you'd call the rich nations, France, Spain, the UK, Germany, all the Scandinavian nations have relatively low Gini coefficients. So they're not so unequal. But look at the US. That's, stands out among all the Western nations as a particularly unequal nation, with particular inequality. It's the same level of inequality as there is in the US, in Mexico. And I would, I always try to sort of tell you what my views on this are. Now, I think the US, with its vast economy, is amazing, and its vast energy is amazing. But there's a danger that that level of inequality will actually start to sap the energy of the US, because the energy of the US is the American dream. But actually, in reality, we'll see later on, maybe on Thursday, that movement from the poor to the rich is relatively rare in the US. It's more happening in the Scandinavian countries and in Europe, where people fled, to the US. They fled to sort of enjoy the American dream, which probably isn't really happening in the same way. So we're gonna really try and unpack what's going on in the US today and on Thursday. Okay, so I'll leave you to look at this yourself. This is a guy called Thomas Piketty, who wrote a very famous book, Capital in the 21st Century. And he's really looking at you know, the historical movement of inequality, especially in Europe and the US. And he's got a wonderful French accent. I really love his accent when he speaks English. He's got this beautiful, lovely French accent when he does it. And he will, you know, basically say that really, like, in the 19th century, Europe was shockingly unequal. You know, it was that sort of class-based sort of system where basically the rich had everything and the poor had virtually nothing. And you know, it shows that in the US it was different. You know, there was social mobility, there was you know, ability to move between classes in the US, but he shows that throughout the 20th century, especially towards the end of the 20th century, things become more equal and more open in terms of social mobility in Europe. And in the US, actually, it becomes more like Europe in the 19th century. It becomes more unequal, more difficult to move from one class to another. And I think that's a dangerous thing for the US. I think it's got to keep its energy of, you know, of being able for people from poor backgrounds to rise up. And, you know, certain things are happening, especially in terms of education, in terms of health, things like that really cause the poor and the bottom sort of sections of society to make, you know, it makes it very difficult for them to move out of it. And as we'll see later on, you know, the middle classes are not particularly moving forward in the way they have traditionally, especially after the Second World War and things like that. Okay, so how do we measure inequality? There's Aladdin, and obviously on his on Aladdin's right there is a genie, and it's the Gini coefficient we use to measure inequality. So that's a bit of a dad joke there, I suppose, but here we are. And this, sometimes you might not get this at first, but it's a clever thing, the Gini coefficient. And so what's going on in this graph? So really, we've got a situation where on the bottom, you've got the household income distribution. So that between 0 to 20%, those are the poorest 20% of a society. Let's call it US society, but this could be any society. And then you've got like 20 to 40%, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 100. And on the right-hand axis, you've got the cumulative share of income. So in this particular situation, the bottom 20% have got about 5% of the income, 5% of the share of income. This is actually sort of wage income. And then the bottom 90% have 55% of income. So, you know, that's because there is this particular curve. Let's ignore the curve for the moment. Look at this line of inequality. So if you imagine a society that is perfectly equal, what you'd have is the bottom 20% would have 20% of the income. Then the next 20% would have another 20% of the income. And even the richest 20%, because obviously there wouldn't be a richest 20% in this society, would still have 20% of the income. So everyone has the same. And that would be a perfectly equal society. And that society has never existed in human history. You'd even question, really, would you actually want to be in such a society? And so ultimately, this Lorenz curve is how much a particular society moves away from that place of absolute equality. So if you imagine it, you know, the worst Lorenz curve, like the biggest sort of Lorenz curve, would be a situation where 99% of people had nothing, and all the wealth, all the income was earned by the top 1%. And that would, imagine that line would be virtually all of this area. So basically, the bigger the A is, this area A, is the amount of inequality there is in a society. Obviously, it's gonna be a bit of a curve, but like, say for example, if the bottom 20% had 10% of the income, which, you know, would be pretty good, you know. That, you know, that Lorenz curve would be a bit further up, and so the society would be less unequal. And so we work this out through getting the A area over the whole area, so A over A plus B. And so obviously the bigger A is, the bigger that number. It's going to be a number between 0 and 1 because it's a ratio. So remember what we were looking at when we were looking at sort of countries like, was it Bolivia, that's sort of, you know, around 0.6. So it's, you know, that's a big Lorenz curve. That means really just it's a quite a small section of society that's really holding all the income in a society. And so we'll, you know, try and get your head around this. We'll have homework questions to help you understand, and, you know, come to my office hours if you want to for me to explain it even more. But that's how we do, you know, work out the Gini coefficient. Now, we're going to talk about this more on Thursday, but I want you to sort of really sort of try and understand something about the Gini coefficient. So the Gini coefficient is usually based on earnings inequality before taxes. So so if you look at the green line, that's, you know, what are people earning? What's the sort of difference in people's earnings, and how unequal are they? And you can see that they're sort of about the same in the United States, Sweden, and Japan. You know, Japan is more unequal in terms of earnings before taxes. The US is more than any of the three, and Sweden's pretty high. But look what happens after taxes. After taxes in Sweden, there's a real, you know, things are much less unequal because you know, taxes are pretty high in Sweden. You know, taxes are relatively higher in Japan than in Sweden, but they're still, you know, higher, you know, sort of, sorry, Japan have less taxes than Sweden, but there's still more taxes than in the US. And in the US, you don't really have much of a change of inequality after tax, because obviously with the US tax system, rich people are not taxed that much. And that's obviously very nice for people, you know, rich people, but that has an effect of not really distributing income sort of that much. So that's, you know, before tax and after tax. And there's all sorts of questions about whether, you know, you work it out before tax or after tax. And it tends to be a sort of mixture of the two when you're calculating the Gini coefficient. But what about this blue line here? And that, in a way, is the bigger question, because this is all about income inequality. It's all about wage inequality. But do you think that the real top 1%, the top 5%, even the top 10%, do you think they get their money through a wage? Do you think they get their money through their sort of pay packet at the end of the month? Probably not. You know, the vast amount of wealth, you know, in the world is held in stocks and bonds. Remember, we talked about, you know, M1 and M2. M2 is the money markets and hedge funds and this money that's just, you know, in fact, it's just on paper in reality, that's just earning money all the time, earning interest all the time. And obviously, when it comes to people possessing that, that's, you know, that's a much more unequal situation. So if you had the Gini coefficient there, you know, you're talking about, it's probably Gini coefficient 0.82. So probably, you know, it literally is the top 10% that's got all that wealth, you know, that properties, you know, all sorts of things where people are just making money off money, or, you know, having passive income streams. That's you know, very much concentrated in a certain section. But look at Sweden. It's actually even worse in Sweden. You know, again, the whole sort of old money, old aristocrats, old rich people that just have built up money over time. Interesting enough, when it comes to wealth inequality, Japan, doesn't look too bad. I don't know why that is. I'll have to look into that. But try and remember, and when we really look into on Thursday and we start to look about how the top 10%, the top 5%, the top 1% are just going up and up and up, and the middle classes are stagnating. This is much more about wealth inequality, because obviously very rich people don't earn money. They earn money off money. That's why they're so rich. And we've seen that globalization makes that worse. So on Thursday, we're going to try and really break this difference down between wealth inequality and wages inequality. And that's in a way where we're going to get to the real, sort of nub of a lot of these issues. Okay, so be thinking about that. And on Thursday, we're going to really sort of look into that very sort of deeply. Okay, so that's hopefully this video's worked, and I'll see you on Thursday.